Let's first look at the anatomy of an ASP.NET MVC application. So we're going to create a new project, and this is of course going to be a web project. So ensure that web is selected on the left side of this new project window. Now I am a C# guy, so all of the code within this course is going to be in C#. Now if you like Visual Basic, feel free to follow along with Visual Basic. You'll just have to translate between C# and Visual Basic. Now for the target framework, I have selected 4.5.1 because that's the latest version and I like using the latest bits if I can. Now if you are familiar with older versions of ASP.NET and Visual Studio, you are used to seeing multiple projects here listed underneath web. We don't have those anymore. We just have this one project type. So we create a single ASP.NET web application, and then we get to choose what technologies we want to use within that application. So using the default name of Web Application 1, let's click on OK. And in this new ASP.NET project window, we get to choose what type of ASP.NET application we want to create. We can create an empty application, a web forms application, MVC, web API, and so on. Now notice that we have these checkboxes down here, add folders and core references for web forms, MVC, and web API. And as I select these templates, you can see that these checkboxes change. And of course, if you select the MVC template, MVC is also checked down here, and we cannot uncheck it. That would be kind of difficult to remove MVC from an MVC application. But we can include both web forms and web API within an MVC application. And in fact, we can include MVC and web API in a web forms application, and we can include all of these things within any one of these templates. This is something new that's being touted as a one ASP.NET. It allows us to create an ASP.NET application and use whatever technology that we want to, basically whenever we want to. And that is a very powerful thing. So over on this right-hand side, we see this change authentication. Now for this lesson, we're going to create an application using this MVC template. And it's going to give us a lot of things out of the box. And one of those is authentication. Now we can change the authentication for our application. We can set it to no application, which basically means that there is none. We don't need any authentication. There's the individual user accounts, which is going to use the new ASP.NET identity for the membership provider. And I don't really know if we can say membership anymore because everything is under the umbrella of ASP.NET identity. Then there's this organizational accounts. This is set up for using Active Directory or Azure Active Directory or Office 365 as our authentication scheme. So your application could, by default, tie into those services if you wanted it to. And then there's the Windows authentication, which is primarily used for intranet applications. This basically gets the authentication information from the computer that's browsing the intranet website. The browser passes that information onto the web server, which is then passed on to the application. So that's also helpful as well. For our purposes, we're just going to use the individual user accounts. We're not really going to do much with identity in this lesson. In fact, we're not going to do anything with identity in this lesson, but we will include it just the same. Now, because this is the default MVC application, it's going to give us a lot of things that we don't really need in order to run a simple MVC application. So let's first of all run this, and we will see what we are given. We have a lot of markup already, we have styling, we have authentication already built in, so if we wanted to log in, which we can't because we don't have a user, we would need to register the user first and then log in. All of this is set up for us. So if we wanted to use this as a basis for our application, we could do that if we wanted to. So let's look at these folders and files that we have here. We'll start with this app_start folder. Now there's nothing really special about app_start. It looks like an ASP.NET folder like app_data and app_code, but in this case, it really isn't special. It's primarily here just for organizational purposes. All of these classes are used with the startup of the website, but it's not because they are inside of this folder. If we look at the global.asax, This is where our application starts. And you can see that here is where we are using the classes inside of app_start to set up these different components within an MVC application. There is, however, an exception, and that is this startup class. If you open up startup.cs, you'll see this partial class called startup. The other part to this startup class is here within the app_start folder, this startup.auth.cs file. So we have this startup class, and what makes this special is this Owen startup attribute is being passed the type of this startup class. Now, Owen is fairly new to ASP.NET. It stands for Open Web Interface for .NET, and it basically decouples the web server from the web application. So we can build an MVC application, take it off of IIS, and put it inside of a self-hosted service. Owen is going to change the way that we write ASP.NET applications because it's basically forcing Microsoft to take system.web, which is where ASP.NET has lived, and break it up into individual components so that you can write an ASP.NET application and only use the pieces of ASP.NET that you want to use. So for example, if you want an ASP.NET application that has no caching, you can do that, and the caching stuff that would normally be within system.web is not loaded. The idea of Owen is to be able to create bare bones ASP.NET applications with only the components that we need. And we're going to spend some time with Owen in this course. We're not going to dig into its guts or anything like that. We're going to look at it at a higher level because I want to focus on MVC. But the next version of ASP.NET is going to be very, very interesting because a lot of things are changing. And a lot of that is due to Owen and a project called Katana, which is Microsoft's implementation of Owen. Okay, so we have this global.asax file, and inside of here is this application start event handler. So for all intents and purposes, this is where the application starts, other than this startup.cs. So if we have some other things that we need to configure, we can do so inside of this application_start method, or we can do what has been patterned here, and that is create a class for registering the component that we want to register, and then putting that class inside of app_start. Underneath this folder is the content folder, and this currently just contains CSS files. The content folder is not needed, so if we wanted to, we could delete that and our application is going to run just fine. But of course we don't want to do that because it contains CSS files. So if we wanted to, we could rename this as CSS and everything would work just fine as long as we change the references inside of the markup to point to this new CSS folder. And the same is true for the fonts folder and the scripts folder. I personally prefer the folder names of CSS and JS, one for CSS, the other for JavaScript, but that's just my personal preference. The next folder is controllers. Now the controllers folder itself isn't necessary, but what is necessary is that our controller classes reside within the controllers namespace. So we could rename this folder to controllers1, and everything would be fine because account controller and home controller are still within this controller's namespace. But it really doesn't make sense to do that because the convention in any .NET application is to organize your code files in folders that represent the namespace. So we typically use the controllers folder. You can break the controllers out into a separate project so that that project could be called web application1.controllers, and then your controller classes would be in there, and that would be fine. And we might do that sometime within this course. The next folder is models. Now the models folder is not necessary, and the models namespace is not necessary. It's just here for organizational purposes. So we could change the namespace of these classes, and as long as all of the references to those classes were updated to use the new namespace, then everything would be fine. The views folder, however, is required. It is convention, but it's one of those conventions that we actually have to follow. Now, inside of this views folder, we have three other folders. We have one called account, one called home, and then one called shared. Now, the account and home folders refer to the controllers of account controller and home controller. The account controller views are contained within the account folder, and the home controller views are contained within the home controller. We cannot change this. That's not true. Actually, we can change it, but in order to automatically refer to views between the account controller and the account views, then the folder name inside of the views folder has to match that of the controller. So account controller goes with account, home controller goes with home. And then there's this shared folder. The shared folder is, as its name implies, contains shared assets that are used between all of our other controllers. And inside of the shared folder, you can see this underscore layout page. It's basically a template that all of the pages within our views use for the layout of our page. Then we have partial views, which basically allows us to reuse markup. And then we have this underscore view start file. The code that we put inside of this CS.html file is going to execute for every view. So you can see that on line 2, the layout is set to ~/views/shared/_layout.cshtml. So all of our views inside of the account and the home controllers are going to use this layout page. And also something very important is that the views folder has a config file, and we might do some poking around inside of this config file. And then finally, we have the config file for the project itself. All of the settings and configuration that isn't defined inside of our config classes are defined here. And off the top of my head, I can't really think of anything that we will be modifying here, but we will see as this course goes on. In the next lesson, I'm going to introduce you to controllers and how we use them within an MVC application.